Iran blockade. On April 13, 2026, at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Navy began blockading every ship attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports. The order came 21 hours after peace talks collapsed in Islamabad. Vice President J.D. Vance had flown to Pakistan with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner for the highest-level face-to-face meeting between the United States and Iran since 1979. The talks lasted through the night. By morning, Vance walked out. Iran had refused to commit to zero uranium enrichment, refused to dismantle its nuclear facilities, refused to stop funding proxy militias, and refused to relinquish its right to charge ships a toll to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Trump announced the blockade on Truth Social minutes later. Effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM clarified the scope. The blockade applies only to ships going to or from Iranian ports. Ships transiting the strait to non-Iranian destinations remain free to pass. Over 10,000 U.S. personnel, more than a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft began enforcing the operation. On day 1, 6 commercial ships complied and turned back. On day 2, at least 4 ships linked to Iran crossed the strait anyway. According to BBC Verify, one was a Chinese sanctioned tanker. It passed through unchallenged. The United Kingdom refused to join. The European Union refused. China condemned the blockade. Russia condemned it. Australia refused. Iran's IRGC declared that any U.S. military vessel approaching the strait would be considered a ceasefire violation and would receive a severe response. The ceasefire expires April 21st. A second round of talks is under discussion. Cuba Quarantine. On October 14, 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction at San Cristobal, Cuba. The missiles were capable of reaching Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes. President Kennedy was briefed on October 16. He did not tell the public for 6 days. On October 22nd, he went on national television and announced a naval blockade of Cuba. He did not call it a blockade. He called it a quarantine. The distinction was deliberate. Under international law, a blockade is an act of war. A quarantine is not. 250 U.S. warships formed a line 500 miles off the Cuban coast. 25 Soviet ships were en route to Cuba, some carrying additional missiles. Khrushchev ordered his ships to reverse course on the morning of October 23rd, more than 24 hours before the famous confrontation that Secretary of State Dean Rusk described as eyeball to eyeball. The Soviet ships had already turned around. The confrontation never happened. What did happen was below the surface. Soviet submarine B-59 lost contact with Moscow and had been depth charged by U.S. Navy ships for days. The captain believed war had started. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. The captain ordered it armed. On Soviet submarines, launching required agreement from 3 officers. 2 agreed. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. The torpedo was not launched. On October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the Cuban missile sites. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The quarantine was lifted on November 20th, 1962, after 38 days. The Moscow-Washington hotline was established the following year as a direct result of how close both sides had come. Iraq strangled. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. 4 days later, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 661, placing a total embargo on Iraq. Resolution 665 followed, authorizing a naval blockade to enforce it. For the first time since the Korean War, the United Nations had authorized member states to use military force to enforce sanctions. The Maritime Interception Force, led by the United States and including ships from 14 countries, took up position in the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, and Gulf of Oman. Their mandate was to stop any ship carrying goods to or from Iraq. Between August 1990 and the formal end of the blockade in 2003, coalition forces intercepted 19,000 vessels, boarded 12,000, and diverted 900. The blockade outlasted the Gulf War by 12 years. After the liberation of Kuwait in February 1991, the UN maintained sanctions on Iraq to force compliance with weapons inspections. The naval blockade continued enforcing those sanctions. It ran continuously for 13 years, the longest sustained naval blockade in modern history. Iraq was allowed to export limited quantities of oil under the UN Oil for Food program, beginning in 1996, with proceeds going directly to purchase food and medicine. The program was eventually estimated to have involved over 2,200 companies across 66 countries, many of which paid illegal kickbacks to the Iraqi government to secure contracts, the largest corruption scandal in UN history. The blockade ended on May 22, 2003, 6 weeks after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. By that point, Iraq had been cut off from maritime trade for nearly 13 years. Tanker War. At 10:15 p.m. on May 17, 1987, an Iraqi Mirage F-1 fighter jet fired 2 Exocet missiles at the USS Stark, a U.S. Navy frigate patrolling the Persian Gulf. 37 American sailors were killed. 21 Iran were wounded. Iraq apologized and said the pilot had mistaken the Stark for an Iranian tanker. The United States blamed Iran. The Iran-Iraq war had spilled into the Gulf in 1984. Iraq was attacking Iranian oil infrastructure. Iran was retaliating by hitting tankers serving Arab ports, including Kuwait. Kuwait asked for protection. The Soviet Union agreed first, chartering tankers to Kuwait in early 1987. The United States followed, offering to reflag 11 Kuwaiti tankers under the American flag and escort them through the Gulf. The operation was called Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II. On the first convoy, a mine hit the reflagged tanker Bridgeton. The blast ripped a hole in her hull. The U.S. Navy ships assigned to escort her had no mine-clearing capability. They fell in behind the tanker and let her lead the way. Iran mined the Gulf throughout the operation. The USS Samuel B. Roberts struck a mine in April 1988, nearly sinking. The U.S. retaliated by destroying Iranian oil platforms and sinking several Iranian warships in a single day. Operation Praying Mantis, the largest U.S. naval surface engagement since World War II. On July 3, 1988, USS Vincennes was skirmishing with Iranian fast boats in Iranian territorial waters when its radar picked up an aircraft. The crew identified it as an Iranian F-14. It was Iran Air Flight 655, an Airbus A300 carrying 290 passengers, including 65 children. Both missiles hit. There were no survivors. Iran agreed to a ceasefire with Iraq 6 weeks later. Venezuela seized. In early 2026, the Trump administration ordered a naval blockade of Venezuela as part of an operation targeting President Nicolás Maduro and his government's use of state oil revenues to evade U.S. sanctions. The blockade targeted Venezuelan oil exports specifically. Tankers carrying Venezuelan crude were boarded in international waters, including in the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from Venezuela's coast. The U.S. accused Venezuela of using falsely flagged ships and third-country intermediaries to move sanctioned oil and bypass financial restrictions, a near-identical playbook to Iran's Shadow Fleet operations. In February 2026, a U.S. Coast Guard vessel boarded a sanctioned tanker in the Indian Ocean. The boarding team seized the cargo and diverted the vessel, but it was one of the first enforcement actions of its kind conducted that far outside the traditional blockade zone, a signal that the administration intended to interdict sanctioned Venezuelan oil wherever it moved, not just in adjacent waters. Maduro was subsequently captured. The circumstances and exact date of his capture have not been fully disclosed publicly. The operation against Venezuela was concluded before U.S. military focus shifted to Iran in late February 2026 following Operation Epic Fury. The Venezuelan blockade served as the direct template for the Iran blockade announced on April 13. Same legal framework, same enforcement mechanism, same commander. Gaza Sealed. In January 2009, Israel formally declared a naval blockade of the Gaza Strip. The blockade's stated purpose was to prevent weapons smuggling into Gaza by Hamas. It restricted all maritime traffic within 20 nautical miles of Gaza's coast and later reduced that zone to 6 nautical miles for Palestinian fishermen. On May 31, 2010, a flotilla of 6 ships carrying humanitarian aid and 590 activists attempted to breach the blockade. The largest vessel was the MV Mavi Marmara, a Turkish-flagged ship operated by the IHH humanitarian organization. The Israeli Navy warned the flotilla by radio to divert to Ashdod port. The flotilla refused. At 4 a.m., Israeli Shayatet 13 naval commandos repelled from helicopters onto the Mavi Marmara's deck. Passengers armed with iron bars and knives resisted. Israeli forces responded with live ammunition. 9 activists were killed, 8 of them Turkish nationals. A 10th died in hospital 4 years later. 10 Israeli commandos were wounded. A UN Human Rights Council investigation found the raid illegal and described Israeli actions as demonstrating an unacceptable level of brutality. The UN Secretary General's parallel inquiry found the degree of force used excessive and unreasonable. Israel apologized to Turkey in 2013 for operational mistakes. Israeli soldiers involved are being tried in absentia in Turkish courts for war crimes. The blockade continues. In June 2025, Israeli forces intercepted the Madeleine, carrying climate activist Greta Thunberg and French MEIP Rima Hassan. In April 2026, Israeli forces boarded the global Sumud flotilla of 44 vessels carrying 500 activists. All were diverted to Ashdod. Biafra Starved. On May 30th, 1967, the southeastern region of Nigeria declared independence as the Republic of Biafra. The region was home to the Igbo people, who had fled north following ethnic massacres that killed an estimated 30,000 Igbo in 1966. The Nigerian federal government refused to recognize the secession and launched a military campaign to reintegrate the region by force. The Nigerian Navy established a naval blockade of Biafra's coastline, cutting the breakaway region off from maritime trade and supply routes. Nigeria controlled Biafra's only seaport at Port Harcourt, Court, which fell to federal forces in May 1968. Once the port fell, the blockade was total. No food, medicine, or fuel could enter by sea. Biafra had a population of roughly 14 million people at the start of the war, and as the federal military closed in and the blockade held, the food supply collapsed. Images of starving Biafran children, distended stomachs, visible ribs, the condition known as kwashiorkor, were broadcast around the world. They are among the defining humanitarian photographs of the 20th century and directly inspired the modern international aid and food relief movement. Between 1 and 3 million people died. The majority died not from combat, but from starvation and disease caused by the blockade and the collapse of the food supply. Relief flights attempted to reach Biafra at night through Nigerian airspace. Nigeria shot some of them down. Biafra surrendered on January 15, 1970. The war lasted 2.5 years. The blockade was the decisive weapon. Leningrad Siege. On September 8, 1941, German forces completed the encirclement of Leningrad, cutting the city off from land supply routes. The German Navy simultaneously sealed off the Gulf of Finland, blocking any resupply by sea. The siege had begun. Leningrad was the Soviet Union's second largest city, home to 3 million people. Hitler's plan was not to capture the city, it was to starve it into surrender. German High Command issued an order explicitly stating that requests for surrender would not be accepted, that the city was to be sealed and left to collapse from within. By November 1941, the daily bread ration for civilians had fallen to 125 grams, roughly 2 slices. People ate sawdust mixed into bread, wallpaper paste, leather belts, and pets. Bodies were left in the streets because the living were too weak to bury them. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, approximately 100,000 people died of starvation every month. The only supply route was across Lake Ladoga, the road of life. In winter, trucks drove across the frozen lake under German artillery fire and air attack. In summer, barges made the crossing. The route kept the city alive but could not supply enough to stop the dying. The siege lasted 872 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944. Approximately 1 million civilians died, the majority from starvation. It is the deadliest siege in recorded history. The Soviet Union never surrendered the city. At the Nuremberg trials, the deliberate starvation of Leningrad's civilian population was cited as a war crime, and the tactic of using naval and land blockades to starve civilian populations was subsequently codified as a violation of international humanitarian law. The same legal framework cited today when evaluating the blockades of Gaza, Biafra, and Iran.